Over the last few days, you probably saw some headlines going around talking about how Google, with their Pixel phones, have a pretty severe brand loyalty problem. Now, this data was being sourced from a website called Statista. This was a study done of, you can see here, 4,400 Apple users, 2,700 Samsung users, and a little less than 500 Google Pixel users. And they were asking these people if they were very unlikely or very likely to switch phone brands with their next phone. Here's the question: how likely are you to change your smartphone brand at the next possible occasion? And as you can see here, there are some pretty interesting results. Apple users are the most unlikely to switch brands, with Samsung coming in 5% behind them. And then Google, with their Pixel devices, are flip-flopped. Only 26% of people said they were very unlikely to switch brands, and 57% said they were very likely to switch brands. Now, at first glance here, you may say this appears to be a pretty big problem for Google. And we're going to talk about what might be causing this and kind of dive into that a bit. But first, I want to kind of break down what we have here in terms of the data, because I think there are actually some pretty big problems with this data in general. Before I do that, though, I want to make it very, very clear that I do believe the general idea of this study, of these results. I do have no problem believing that Apple users are probably the least likely to switch brands. Samsung users are probably behind them to some degree. I actually think it's probably more than a 5% difference. And I have no problem believing that Pixel users are probably the least likely to stick with their brand. I just don't know that I trust these numbers for reasons that we're going to get into. So reason number one is quite obvious. We can look again at the number of people that were actually asked these questions, and the Pixel users are by far the smallest sample size. So that is going to introduce a lot of noise into the data. We just don't have a big enough sample size to really say for sure how true this actually is. Problem number two is that this is incomplete data. Surely to goodness, their only options were not very unlikely and very likely. This seems like we're going for the extreme answers only. There should have been a much broader set of answers potentially given. And if we had that full data, who knows how different this could have actually turned out. I also just want to point out how wildly variable these studies actually are. Let's jump to another study that was done by CellCell back in March of 2021, and let's look at some of their results, because they are in like wild disagreement with what we have here from Statista. iPhone users in their study, when asked if they intended to stay with their current brand or switch the next time they upgrade, 92% of iPhone users say they were staying put. Only 49% according to Statista. With Samsung, it was 74%. Again, we are only at 44% there. And then if we look at the Google results, they said 65% of Pixel users intended to stay, a totally opposite result. Now, again, we have exactly what I said you should be expecting. iPhone had the best brand loyalty. Samsung was quite a bit behind them, but still doing quite well. And then the Pixel was below that. Now, I also want to point out that in this study by CellCell, if we scroll down to the methodology, we will see a very similar sort of problem. 2,000 iPhone users, 2,000 Galaxy users, 400 Pixel users. So again, by far the smallest sample size was the Google Pixel users. And again, this can generate some noise. But at any rate, we have two studies which are 2 years apart with wildly different results. Now you could say, Shane, these are, like you said, they're 2 years apart. So maybe things have just changed that much in 2 years. Well, let's think about this. Do you think the brand loyalty for iPhone has dropped by half in 2 years? Do you think it's dropped by nearly half for Samsung in 2 years? Do you think the Pixel brand loyalty has dropped from 65% all the way down to 26% in a roughly 2-year span? No, I don't think that that's what has happened at all. I think what you have here are studies done of relatively small amounts of people and studies done with questions that are phrased in different ways. Like I said, we have one study restricting things down to very likely, very unlikely, whereas this one is just asking if they intend to stay. Now, that may seem like a very small difference, but in studies with small sample sizes, this can generate wildly different results. And because of that, I think that this data is interesting, but I do not think in any way, shape, or form it is the end all be all. I think that the general idea, ranking these, Apple, Samsung, Google, that's fine. But actually drilling down and looking at these numbers as if they are something to take super seriously, I think would be a mistake. All of that being said, if you do look at things more broadly as ranking brand loyalty, Apple, Samsung, Google, there are some interesting things to think about there. And I think there are some obvious explanations for how we got to that point. You could rephrase this from being brand loyalty ratings as being ecosystem lock-in ratings just as easily. And I think if you frame it that way, you're going to get the same result. Who has the strongest ecosystems? Well, Apple's number one, Samsung's probably number two, and the Pixels are behind those. Those ecosystems, as I talked about in a prior video, for Google, it's just beginning to be a thing. They now finally have some good earbuds. They just now got a watch. They don't really have a laptop anymore. Clearly, their ecosystem is not as strong at locking people in. You also have to consider the fact, I believe this is anecdotal, just for people I've spoken to, but I believe that Pixel people that buy Pixel phones, tend to be the sorts of people that just aren't that brand loyal. They tend to be people that are switching phones. That's been the case for me, right? I went with the Pixel 2, and then I think my next phone was an LG phone. I think I had a Motorola phone sometime after that. Like, I've always jumped between brands. I come back to the Pixel a lot. I had a 2. I eventually ended up with a 3. Didn't get a 4, but we did get a 5. Got a 6A. Like, I've jumped in and out of the Pixel world throughout my life. And I think a lot of Pixel users are like that. So the ecosystem's not as strong. Pixel people probably are just switching brands because they're just kind of techie people and they like switching brands. You also have to factor in Pixels have been a bit hit or miss, right? Like, I didn't care about the Pixel 4 because I don't care about Face Unlock. The battery life was apparently worse, and I already didn't love the Pixel 3 because of the poor battery life. So another device with kind of poor battery life I wasn't really into, but then the Pixel 5 came out, improved the battery life, kind of refined the design a little bit, so we jumped back on board there. And I think that that maybe has been the case with a lot of people. The Pixels have been a bit hit or miss, and they've also had some hit or miss problems, right? I've reported on the back glass on some Pixels. I think it was the Pixel 6 or maybe 7. I don't remember. I think it was the 7, yeah, because they changed the material around the glass on the back visor. Glass breaking, that maybe is putting some people off. We have news stories about server side issues causing drain for people for a couple of days on their batteries before being fixed. Pixels have this reputation for being a little bit finicky at times. I think that that's hurting. There's a lot of reasons here, guys. We also have the fact that the Pixel 5 was kind of like a year off for the Pixels. They kind of didn't make a flagship that year and made like a mid-ranger, and then basically rebranded and relaunched the Pixel line with the Pixel 6, a totally new design that is going from here. So you could almost look at things like the Pixel 6 was a Pixel 1, the 7 is a Pixel 2, and the 8 is a Pixel 3. There's kind of been like this soft relaunch. And since then, it feels like loyalty and excitement around the brand has in fact been going up. And there is some data here from a YouGov study that shows consideration scores. This only goes up to 2022, but you can see that it jumped very, very sharply in 2022 with this sort of soft relaunch. So I do think things are headed in the right direction, but there have been plenty of reasons why prior to that, brand loyalty just has not been as strong. It will be very interesting to see if Google can continue to build on some of their recent success. Hopefully the Pixel 8 can launch and be quite stable and not have some of the early problems that the Pixel devices have sort of been plagued with. Hopefully that's also true of the Pixel Fold, and they can really start to build this out and become a really strong competitor to Apple and Samsung, because that would, I think, be good for the entire phone market. The more really solid competitors we have, the more options people have in terms of a truly viable way to go from one brand to another. I think that's just better for consumers in general. Guys, thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments down below. I will see you on the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.